Bienvenidos a la charla de nuestra invitada de hoy, Beatriz Jaguaribe, que es una vieja conocida nuestra, que pasa su tiempo entre Brasil y Nueva York, y sería casi redundante que yo me pusiera ahora a explicar con detalle todas sus publicaciones sobre... pero en cualquier caso redundante, teniendo en cuenta que la tenemos aquí, que nos va a hablar directamente ella de ciudades como arenas culturales. Y simplemente quiero que se unan a mí para dar la bienvenida a Beatriz Jaguaribe. Gracias.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Es un súper gusto estar acá. Hace años me invitó Alberto para una charla aquí, una conferencia, entonces es un súper gusto. I'm thrilled de estar aquí nuevamente. I'm going to switch to English. Gracias a Graciela por la invitación. I haven't switched.
No, you haven't.
No. And Hernán, has gone to Argentina, unfortunately, no? I don't want to talk very long, so I'm policing myself. When Graciela wrote to me and said, Beatriz, do you want to come and give us a talk? And I said, of course, wonderful. And what are you going to talk about? And I said, okay, cities as cultural arenas, etc. The initial idea was actually to offer a comparative analysis between different Latin American cities. But what has happened is that recent events in Rio have been catching up with me, and I always have to be updating my writing of a book that I have that is about to be published by Routledge next year. So in the end, I felt I had too much material, and I felt compelled to kind of address the current issues that are going on, movements, protests, all kinds of things, right? So my case study is actually going to be centered on Rio. The main question that I am asking in this presentation, what happened? Like the heater thing went out?
Yeah. Good. I think so, yes.
No, it was kind of like a chorus of humming machinery behind me. That's good. But anyhow, so the main question that I'm asking here is really how urban experiences are translated through media and artistic expressions. This is like the overall general framework, right? And my talk is structured so that I don't want it to be very long. If I rush through things, then we'll have at least a moment of debate and questions, or else I'll go on and on and on because I have a lot of material about this. But it's really structured like a slide presentation. And the idea is that I'm going to work around some key concepts, and I'm also going to exemplify these key concepts by certain iconic historical postcards, practically, that condense certain cultural paradigms of the period. Okay? So, sí, bueno, yo puedo ponerme o si no puedo hablar de aquí, tamaño que hable de acá.
Do you like the light or the
What do you guys know? The lights will also won't be able to see my nose, you know, and it will tax my ancient memory. So let's do it like this. Now, okay, so here we go. No, you don't go. No mueve.
I think you have to...
Is it the mouse?
Using the voice mouse?
No. Luis, ayuda. No. From the beginning. It appeared, this, with a mouse. ¿Quieres hacerlo para mí? ¿Puedes cambiar? Mouse, voy a intentar aumentar. Bueno, está aquí. Yo consigo. Está bien, no, yo consigo hacer así, está bien. ¿No? Que voy quiero, no. Okay, so voy a empezar. These are the key concepts that I'm going to work through. Cultural arena, urban experience, media city, lettered city, branded city, imagined city. I think the cultural arena speaks for itself. This is a term that I'm borrowing from Richard Morris. He wrote a very well-known essay from 1982, which is called Peripheral Cities as Cultural Arenas. And of course, the main aspect of that essay was to stress how peripheral cities are not just imitative cities, but they're cities that have forms of appropriation, translation, adaptation, etc. What I want to stress in relation to this concept of the cultural arenas right now, in Rio at least, or in many other cities of Brazil, is that the peripheral city, I consider Rio still a peripheral city, it's between commas, but it still is a peripheral city, that the periphery of the peripheral city has become a very strong cultural arena, has become a fashion and a force. And one of the other things that should be stressed in relation to Morris's already very old article of '82 is the idea that this force and this fashion of the periphery, and I'm talking about favelas, suburbs, etc., is largely achieved also because not only of political agendas, not only because of forces of democratization, but also because of new media technologies that allow for a kind of worldwide communication between not only different favelas, but different global favelas communicating with each other. This brings me to the idea of urban experiences. What do I mean by urban experiences? There's an enormous lineage of very well-known scholars, Simmel, Benjamin, Krakauer, and nowadays Agraven, that would stress that the modern condition and that the city in itself is a place of hyperstimulation, of shock, of fragmentation, of meaninglessness, and essentially it's a place of a breakdown of collective experience. But the point I would like to make in relation to that is so much that of modernist art was reared and energized precisely by this idea of the strangeness of the metropolis, this encounter with a stranger that often came in the form and in the figure of the non-Western person or culture. And although this modernist art was doing this, it was still doing this in cities that were filled with history and that were very much haunted by ghosts. So you have like this discrepancy between the renovation of the agenda, the physical and historical remnants of the city itself. And what I want to point out in relation to these past modernist agendas and the contemporary is that I think not that we are no longer suffering from the shock or hyperstimulation or fragmentation of the city, but I think there's a very strong movement to making the city become a kind of a home, of a re-semantization of the city as a home. And how we re-semanticize the city as a home through specific terrains, favelas, suburbs, neighborhoods, peripheries, and through strategies of production, affection, belonging, pertainment. So this is something that we'll see. By media city, I think that's also self-explanatory, but basically the main point here is that the media is not only churning out narratives and images, the media is making, the media's alter the architectural space of the sense itself. It has material implications in how buildings are made and how connections are formed. Finally, the lettered city, I'm using this in a more limited way than Andrew Rama's term. Andrew Rama referred to a whole elite of the Latin American cities, that whatever. I'm using the lettered city in the sense of really the literature, how the literary imagination creates urban imaginaries, the power of the printed word as a kind of an arbiter of the imaginary, and the current crisis exactly of this lettered city, and whether this lettered city is being invented or not, and what is going on. Finally, the branded city, we're living in the branded city. This was New York in the 1970s, was the place where this kind of activity was launched out. And what is crucial about this is that the branded city is really a city where there is a combination between entrepreneurs, advertising agents, municipal authorities, and all of this is packaged together in order to produce an image of the city so that the city becomes desirable, the city becomes enticing, and the city has a competitive clout in the global scenario. And finally, the imagined city, which permeates all of this, but which is really also about the experiential and the aesthetic experiences of the city. So let me begin with these little tableaus that I mentioned, and what I'm questioning in each one of these small tableaus that will come to the present, from the late 19th century to contemporary Rio, is what kind of urban ambience existed, what form of media was prevalent, what modes of authorship were being essayed, what right to the city and what kinds of public visibility were being granted. And in all of these, I will say, specifically in the case of Rio, that there's cultural ambivalence, there's social contradictions, there's porousness, a word that Bruno Carvalho, researcher in Princeton, loves to use. That's the title of his new book, but it comes from Walter Benjamin and his essay on Naples. And there is this question of hybridism. They're not going to be the same negotiations, but these features are going to be present. And I would like to begin then with this, with Rio de Janeiro, 19th century. This is late 19th century, still the empire. I'm going to go through this fast because, you know, so we can have some moments to talk about all these issues. And my iconic figure here is, of course, Machado de Assis. He was the foremost writer of Brazil in the late 19th century, early 20th century. What is so astonishing about Machado? Here is the newspaper Rua do Ouvidor. You have an enormous tropical nation where practically the entire cultural scenario of that nation is taking place in a very narrow street with shops, bookstores, and cafes. And all of Brazil is paying attention to what's going on in a couple of blocks of an old street in downtown Rio. And Machado emerges as the founder, he becomes the founder of the Brazilian Academy of Letters. And the question that is asked here is how, in a slave-owning society, this man of color, of extremely humble origins, becomes not only overtly visible, but becomes the founder of the very establishment itself. And in what way does he do it? Now, what is so fascinating about him is that he does not do it by producing a kind of Beaux-Arts prose or a kind of very tame, colorful, ornate rhetoric of the lettered city. He does it by reinventing the realist novel through satire, through irony, and through the very deconstruction of realism itself. But what I want to stress is the conditions of authorship. The conditions of authorship here are given by his mastery of the lettered city from within, and by an eclipsing of his origins, not masking necessarily, but an eclipsing. Move on. These are the contemporaries of Machado. These are portraits of slaves taken by a famous photographer, Cristiano Jr., who then made a whole career in Argentina afterwards. He's a very interesting photographer in that sense. Just very quickly, what I want to highlight here is that these are portraits made in the form of the carte de visite. As you know, the carte de visite was essentially the form of the bourgeois portrait. That's the form that people went to the studio to have their pictures taken. And it's very incongruous that you would have urban slaves being shoved into a studio to have their image taken when, you know, they were nameless and they're just put in this kind of picturesque situation. I want to stress this not only because they were Machado's contemporaries, but because there's a Hegelian dialectics to the appearance and disappearance of who has the right to the city. The descendants of these slaves will resurface again in many different avatars and in many different forms. So it's important to point this out. Okay, these are just the other pictures of the urban poor that were also photographed. Notice the difference. The former photograph was inside the studio. This is a canvas cloth that is placed in the street itself. And the urban poor are photographed here. Now this is the other moment. This is another shift that we're going through. We had the little door, very narrow, still kind of colonial-like, and all of a sudden at the beginning of the century, you have this simple avenue, a very wide, Haussmannian kind of avenue with eclectic buildings. Notice how the Sugarloaf is practically dwarfed by the perspective of the photographer, the well-heeled pedestrians, and the whole idea that you had to compete with Buenos Aires. This was like a burning issue at the beginning of the century because Buenos Aires was whiter, more Parisian, chicer, and Rio was left behind, etc., right? And also the lettered city is being substituted here by new protagonists, which are engineers, sanitation doctors, scientists, architects. Finally, you have a tremendous break here in the Vargas era, in the 1930s, and then you have Really, the inauguration of a modern state, a very authoritarian, centralized modern state. You have the choreography of the masses. Notice that these masses were choreographed. They're not out in the street. They're contained within stadiums. But at the same time, you have a tremendous implementation of the modernist agenda. These are the new protagonists and the artists of the lettered city. This is the Museum of Health and Education, the first public modernist building to be built in the world. These are the architects, Lúcio Costa and Niemeyer, Villa-Lobos, the composer, Gustavo Capanema, who was the minister, Portinari, who did the murals, and the famous poet, Carlos Drummond de Andrade, who worked for Gustavo Capanema. So what you have at this moment is a tremendous dispute about who's going to define the vocabularies of the modern, and whether the modernist agenda, according to the international and nationalist agenda, is going to really make it and take place. So this is avidly altering the structure of the city itself. Of course, popular culture features here, and Carmen Miranda goes out as an export product. And what is crucial about this is that the popular culture of Rio de Janeiro becomes nationalized as national Brazilian culture. The new media that is foregrounded here is the radio. So these are the divas of the radio, and this is the widespread media that is going to take this agenda. Then quickly I'll go to Copacabana in the 50s, the inauguration of a new kind of tropical modernity, a modernity of a hedonistic kind of lifestyle by the sea, but at the same time with internationalist pretensions, and a new cult of the urban middle classes that become the protagonists of this consumer culture that is now that is being consolidated, and also an Americanization. Fast food stores are open, illustrated magazines, all kinds of stuff. The photographer of this is Kurt Klausburn, who was a refugee from Vienna and was a doctor in Vienna, was a Jewish refugee, arrived in Brazil and became a photographer and part of these illustrated and contributed to these illustrated magazines. And of course we have a new Bohemia, Vinícius de Moraes, Antônio Carlos Jobim. Bossa Nova is invented, not in Ipanema, but actually in Copacabana, and you have a new combination between popular and literary and journalistic culture. Finally, you have a tremendous break in the 1960s with the military dictatorship, when we see the pictures of the protests at the end. Compare with this one, there's a single banner, Abaixo Ditadura. There's this very homogenizing kind of idea of political protest. And here you have the figures of key intellectuals rebelling against this moment of the closure of the political system. And so you have a kind of a demise of the public intellectual at that moment, about the silencing of this generation. Here you can see Clarice Lispector, who was not a very politicized writer, but there she is wearing her glasses, very chic with her pearl necklace, handing in, a protest too. And this is also coincides with the policy of favela removal. This will be very crucial to our current discussion now, and to how Rio is reshaping its image. This was one of the main favelas in Rio, in the South Zone, that was completely removed. Many of these people were removed to what then became the notorious place, the City of God. And in terms of media, this is the moment where television and Rede Globo network really makes its presence felt through the soap opera, and it begins to be sports soap opera. So Rio loses its political clout as to Brasilia, no longer has any economic relevance in relation to São Paulo, but it becomes a massive audiovisual center. Rede Globo reaches 90% of the television of households in Brazil. People have, televisions and don't have refrigerators. Huh? So it's like an enormous, incredibly powerful conglomerate, one of the most powerful networks in the world. And finally, the last tableau, before I get into the discussion of what is going on in contemporary Rio, is just this snapshot of Barra da Tijuca, which is the most globalized neighborhood in Rio. This is the neighborhood where you have, that is premised by the non-place, by what Marc Roger called the non-place, an overly functional kind of urban layout that is premised by enclosed condominiums, shopping malls, theme parks, and it is in this space that most of the Olympic events are going to take place in the year 2016. This is the horrible Olympic village that is now currently being built. We can go into this later. There are all kinds of enormous transport systems and enormous overhauls that are going to take place. And I'd like to go into this later in detail, not in detail, but open a discussion about this, because I also don't want to demonize necessarily, go through this very political rhetoric all the time of demonizing these urban renewal projects, because I think there are slippages and there are instances where certain things are happening in a different way. But this is the Dictatorship. Of course, when it was announced that Rio was becoming the Olympic city, immediately all these jokes sprouted out on the internet. Here you can recognize the character of Cidade de Deus, right? Okay, Rio Olympics bring cash. You know, and then the Christ the Redeemer statue, suffering triple assault, etc., etc. And then the Olympic symbol that was invented for the event and the guy cowering behind this bombardment of shootouts, right? So what is the recipe for Olympic Rio? Not very original, because it can't be. No, it has to be fitted within a kind of a branded concept. State-of-the-art venues which don't exist and have to be built. New transport systems. The transport system in Brazil is very chaotic. It was part of the protest movements, precisely. New museum circuits. All of this is part of an Olympic pre-hall. Reinvention of the port area, like in Barcelona, like in Buenos Aires, like in Baltimore, like in Rotterdam, like in so many places. Crucial here. New security policies. The pacified favela. And the pacified favela transformed into the trademark of the city. So my questions in regards to this are, what can be experienced in the branded and media city? How is the past remembered in this gentrification of downtown? How are the favelas the new cultural arenas? How is the city being disputed by new forms of cultural consumption, modes of authorship, and political uprisings? And how to interpret then the return of the crowd that has been so massive in the month of June, and that shook and brought all over Brazil. Let's focus here briefly on downtown Rio. This is the invention of the Porto Maravilha, the marvelous port. The idea, this is what it's going to be. The idea is to reunite the port area, the unused port area, to the old downtown area. And for this, they're going to knock down a high-speed avenue. They're going to build signature museums. One of them is the museum by Santiago Calatrava. He's everywhere now. He's in this venue. It's almost hard to mistake. So Santiago Calatrava builds the museum of tomorrow. There is the museum that has been inaugurated, and this is where I point out that there are slippages in this, which is MAR, the Museum of Art of Rio, and it's been a spectacularly welcome museum. It had an extremely interesting exhibit. It had a very organic connection to what the city is about. And so within, these globalized recipes for urban renewal, you have at moments these specific inventions that have a very deep kind of local resonance. And of course, Trump Towers. Trump is also going to make its presence felt and is going to simply alter the skyline of Rio de Janeiro, because Rio was a decadent city for many, many years, and as you well know, decadence is the best way to preserve. I mean, it declines and falls into ruin, but it remains statically the same. So for centuries, people entering through Rio's port, the vision that they would have was of the Sugarloaf, whatever, the mountains, and more or less low-rise buildings. And now Trump Towers and whatnot are going to be these enormous things for enterprises that are going to alter. And of course, the whole popular culture favela complex around that area is also going to change. This is the Morro da Previdência, the oldest favela in Rio de Janeiro, and it's been transformed into a kind of an open-air museum by the favela tours. But what I want to stress here is that sometimes when you are, excavating and building towards new global recipes or museum circuits, The stones of the past actually resurfaced. These are the stones of the old slave port of Valongo. Valongo was was the largest slave port in all of Brazil. And these stones unexpectedly appear. And this was what Valongo was. And this is the 19th century engraving of Hispánica. This is where, African slaves were imported, they were sold out in this region. So that they was found in the excavation bones, pipes, chains, this whole terrible history resurfacing in the midst of this whole experience of the branding pattern. I mentioned before that a crucial issue of this transformation of Rio was really to transform the vision of the favelas and to have kind of a branding process of the favelas. Not just that, it's unfair to say it's not that. Many things are occurring, but one of them is really that. And why is this branding process? First of all, to overcome this. This was the vision that since the 1980s was widely spread of Rio de Janeiro's favelas and the tremendous dispute between the police and the drug dealers, enormous unprecedented toll of violence and carnage, etc. In 1993, there was this massacre in Vigário Geral and a favela in the northwestern zone of Rio, and this spurred a journalist, Luigi Ventura, to write a book called The Divided City, which is actually not an apt break because Rio has many problems, but it is not really a divided city. And so the whole notion now of this branding is to say, no, we're not a divided city, we're reclaiming terrain by the state. We are undertaking urban renewal projects. There are new possibilities of democratization, citizenship, etc., etc. And these were the classic images of the mainstream, the police entering the favela, the adolescent drug dealer that features in the films Cidade de Deus and all of that stuff. Precisely this favela of the 1980s and the 1990s that enters the picture through the violence of the drug trade also is the terrain that ignites a tremendous boom, like a veritable boom of productions of films, documentaries, reportage, public photography, fiction around the idea of the favelas, around the idea of the drug trade. And as I have commented in many, many essays, all these productions, they're predominantly structured around different codes of realism. So here you have all this kind of bestseller favela phenomena. But what is the importance of these codes of realism? First of all, I would say they offer kind of a pedagogy. They accentuate the aesthetics of verisimilitude. They provide dramatic intensity. They address an authorship testimony, the place where one speaks and to whom one speaks. But most of all, what I think is very compelling about these registers is that we're offering like entertainment, such as films such as The Big Squad, City of God, etc., etc. But because of the force of the dramatic intensity of the realist register, they are also saying this is what it is like. This is reality, and they're read not as fiction, although they proclaim themselves to be fiction, but they're read as, we are offering you an interpretive ballast of what is really going on. Notice in these films how didactic they are. In City of God, the guy explains, the voiceover explains the whole thing with the favela. It starts like this, and then they package like that, and then they do like that. And the film Elite Squad, which was not such a hit here, but which was an enormous hit in Brazil, there's a whole explanation about the corruption of the police forces, how they deal, how they do, etc., etc. So you're having a kind of a pedagogical entertainment vision, and this use, none of this would have the same social impact if this realist register is not summoned to present this picture. Because we have naturalized so much the fictions of realism and the aesthetics of realism. This is absorbed as a kind of, this is reality. And at the same time, reality itself becomes excessively spectacularized precisely because of the nature of this naturalization of the realist register. Now, aside from that, the word favela has no longer refers just to a specific location, to slums in Brazil. It has become a worldwide trademark. from the flip-flops Havaianas that were sold as suffragists for outlandish prices, to all kinds of boutique restaurants and whatever. This is the restaurant Favela Chic in Paris. There's a Favela Chic in London. There is a Miss Favela in Brooklyn. There is a favela restaurant in Sydney. And so this is like a kind of a globalized circulation of the word favela that means something not entirely connected to the actual terrain of the favela itself. And of course, this was furthered by the pop images of Michael Jackson dancing atop the Laje there in 1996. This became like a tourist spot afterwards. The owner of the place where Michael Jackson danced made kind of like a little tourist shrine to where this was, right? And of course, Beyoncé makes an appearance, and Madonna, and etc. They all go up to the favela. The favela is the iconic place where they go eat. Now, here we get to the crucial moment of these policies of occupation. So the idea is that before the police would enter, there would be these battles with the drug dealers, and now there's this notion of police pacification units that you bring not only the police, but you bring kinds of social interaction, new forms of policing, community, whatever. All of these things are in the making. All of these things are extremely varied. All of them are very difficult to summarize. But they bring out in the mainstream media these patriotic images. So here you have the flag of Brazil being unfurled in what was before considered a terrain outside of the jurisdiction of the state, no? And that's an important aspect. And the other important aspect is the massive urbanization projects that are being undertaken in certain key favelas of Rio de Janeiro. Carioca is part of this project. Now I want to stress to you that there are over 700 favelas in Rio de Janeiro, and it's obvious that the 700 favelas are all not going to be urbanized. So the ones that are being tackled are the ones that are very much in the scenic aspects, right? The scenic trail of tourism, or that are very close to very dangerous, to Olympic venues and are therefore have to be targeted. Finally, we come to the cultural circus. So is the favela then becoming the cultural arena, and in what sense? And I think there are very different strands that are operating here. Consumption, belonging, authorship, favela tours that have become an enormous source of money. This is the headlines of one of the newspapers. And aside from the favela tours, what you have is the opening of new boutique hotels and hostels facing the favela. This young Frenchman here has a boutique hotel called Casa It's very expensive boutique hotel, and you face directly the favela of Cantagalo. The other one has a hotel where you have these spectacular views, but it's perched right in the favela. So the favela becomes officially a scenic part of the tourism experience of the Rio. Once again. Here's a mural at the Complexo do Alemão. The Complexo do Alemão was one of the most violent favela complexes in Rio and in Brazil. It was occupied by the army, and then it was later occupied by the police pacification units. And then you have a kind of inauguration of a new cultural popular space with these murals. You have the invention of the cable car that was copied from Medellin, Colombia, and that now has become a kind of tourist craze in all of Rio. All the favelas have to have cable cars, etc., etc. And then you have these panels that adorn each one of the cable car stations. This is a project by Jorge Mario Jauregui, not the panels themselves, but the cable car stations. He's an Argentine architect. And what I would want to mention is kind of, the already preordained idea of what the popular is, how it is going to be represented, how it is going to be enacted. And what we're going to see is that there's an enormous stress on the idea of health, education, and culture, but actually all the NGOs, the huge amount of resources are being spilled right here on the idea of culture, and regular education and health programs are very much, unmatched by this focus on the culture. And here, of course, the favela makes its entrance into the television And this is a fake favela that was invented in the studios of Rede Globo, but at the same time, Rede Globo also films in the real favela, and the spots where Rede Globo films become iconic spots in the favela itself that triggers tourism, consumption, souvenirs, etc., etc., etc. And so favelas to end, favelas as cultural arenas, there's art, circuit, design, music, literature, politics. This is the project of the Morrinho that was invented by these young men who made a mock kind of maquette of the favela. And this has entered, this is a very interesting project actually, and it has entered a whole international art circuit. It was shown in the Venice Biennale, and then it was sent to art galleries. It was inaugurated in the Museu do Mar. So what I'm saying is that there is the different forms of negotiation and authorship are being essayed here, and the art circuit is one of them. This is the dance of the passinho, the main rhythm of the favelas of Rio, aside from samba, the traditional samba, although that was funk. Funk was very demonized because of its connections to the drug trade, of its very lurid sexual lyrics. And so in pacified favelas, all the funk parties have practically been banned. And in its wake, what happened is that, not deliberately, but people started to invent alternative forms of dancing. And these kids started to train and film themselves with small cameras while they were doing these new steps. And this became viral through the new media of cell phone and internet. Because the favelas, there's only 10% of computers in favela, but there's an enormous range of cell phones, and people are more and more, this digital, the cheapening of digital technology is allowing people to manipulate all these media and produce and invent things. So what my point here is that this happens kind of organically, but then immediately it reaches a kind of a media circuit. The Globo says, okay, let's sponsor this, Coca-Cola sponsors this, and then this becomes a kind of, it's part, this is not to deny the inventiveness of this, but to say that this is also part of a kind of a branding of domestication that is going on also. And then all these endeavors of the photographic workshops where you have a right to self-expression, you take your own picture, you represent your community, so on and so forth. The agency Olhares by Vincent Rosendal, the difference here is that he recruits photographers from both inside and outside the favela. This is Valcione Silvestri from the favela Vidigal that has become the most chic favela in all of Rio. In fact, when Vietnamese bought a house, the prices of favelas, the scenic favelas have risen dramatically, and they are now in middle